Hello everyone, welcome to Maven Knowledge. This is the 7th chapter on verb, and in this video I'm going to talk about modal verbs must and ought to, where to use must and where to use ought to. So if you are not aware, modal verbs are part of auxiliary verbs which support the main verb, and these are the modal verbs: can, could, may, might, must, ought to, shall, should, will, would. I have made separate videos on each of these modal verbs, so you can refer to those videos. Now let's talk about where to use must and ought to. Now we will begin with where to use must. So must is used to express that something has to be done. It refers to present and future tense expressions. Examples: you must follow this. Okay, this is talking about present. You must file a complaint. That's talking about future. The second way to use must is, in case of past expressions, it is always used with have plus past participle. So she must have gone home. Okay, so must is used in case of present tense, future expressions, past expressions, but when we are referring to past expressions, it will always be used with have plus past participle. Okay. Then ought to refers to moral obligations, duty. It is more or less functions as a synonyms of should, and this is more formal than should. We ought to stop drinking. That means we should stop drinking. So ought to is more formal. You ought to be polite with her, or we can also say you should be polite with her. But ought to is more formal. This other way is, the negative sentences are formed by adding not after ought. Ought not to, or oughtn't to. Examples: we oughtn't to have talked to her like that. So we oughtn't to have talked to her like that. Questions form for ought to is very formal and it's better to use should. So now let's dig in more on where to use ought to. So ought to is used when things which are desired or which is a necessity. We ought to have more dustbins across the country. Okay, so this is something which is desired, which is the necessity. The second one is probability. There ought to be more dog parks in the city center. Third one is, it talks about present and future activities. In case of past activities, it is used with have plus past participle. We ought to have believed him. We ought to have believed him. Now let's talk more about where to use must. First is strong obligation or necessity, present and future. We must get up early in the morning. Must is used in case of strong obligation, only in case of present and future expressions. So we must get up early in the morning. And when we are talking about any obligation or necessity for past expression, we will always use have to instead of must. Then probability. She must have reached home by now. Ought to is also used in case of probability. Then strong willingness or strong determination. I must take my studies seriously now. Now let's look at the difference between the two. Must is used in case of strong obligation or necessity, both in case of present and future expressions. We must get up early in the morning. Ought to expresses obligation, duty, necessity, which is more or less like an advice. Okay, so must is used for strong obligation and necessity, keeping in mind present and future expression, and ought to is also used in case of obligation and necessity, but it's more like an advice to someone. Okay, you ought to feed the stray animals. I ought to attend the meeting. So it's more like a suggestion. It's more like an advice. Use had to instead of must for past expression. In case of ought to, use have plus past participle in case of past expressions. Examples: we ought to have helped her. So next one is probability. So whenever we use must in case of probability, Must has more stronger probability than ought to. It's like you're almost sure about that. So it's 9 o'clock. Mike must be in the office by now. Ought to is also used in case of probability, but it is less likely than must. So expecting something to be true or real. My friends ought to be here soon for the dinner. So it's more like a expectation. Okay, you're not very sure, you are just expecting. So that's all on must and ought to, and I'll see you in my next video.